In the sweltering heat of September 1942, the spearhead of the German Sixth Army reached the high bluffs overlooking the Volga River. To the German officers, veterans of the lightning campaigns in France and Poland, the city of Stalingrad appeared not as a challenge, but as a final, glorious milestone. General Friedrich Paulus and his staff looked at their maps with a sense of absolute, unshakable arrogance. They believed that the Soviet Red Army was a spent force, a collection of subhuman peasants led by incompetent commissars. The German doctrine of blitzkrieg, coordinated tanks, infantry, and air power, had never been defeated. As the Luftwaffe turned the city skyline into a jagged silhouette of fire and ash, the German command believed the battle was already won before the first soldiers set foot in the outskirts. They mocked the idea of urban warfare, convinced that German discipline and superior technology would sweep the ruins in a matter of days. This was the pinnacle of their hubris. They failed to realize that by destroying the city from the air, they had created the perfect terrain for the defender. They were not marching into a city, they were marching into a gargantuan concrete trap. The rat trap was set, and the German ego was the bait that pulled them across the threshold into an abyss from which few would ever return. Germany took immense pride in its marksmen. The German sniper was a product of the finest military schools in Europe, a surgical instrument of war equipped with the legendary Mauser 98K and precision Zeiss optics. These men were the elite of the elite, taught to view the battlefield as a cold mathematical equation. In the officers' messes in Berlin, they spoke of the Soviet soldier with a sneer, dismissing their marksmen as primitive amateurs using outdated equipment. But in the shattered remains of Stalingrad's tractor factories, that arrogance began to hemorrhage. The Soviet snipers, led by men like Vasily Zaitsev, were not products of military academies. They were sons of the Ural forests in the Siberian taiga. They didn't need a Zeiss lens to understand the language of shadows and the scent of the wind. To the German master race, warfare was a science. To the Soviet sniper, it was an act of survival. The German snipers, accustomed to fighting from a position of technological dominance, suddenly found themselves the hunted. Every broken window, every jagged pipe, every pile of rubble became a potential grave. The masters were about to learn that in a city of ruins, pedigree means nothing, and a peasant's patience is more lethal than a nobleman's rifle. By October, the war of movement had died, replaced by a claustrophobic nightmare the Germans called Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. The city was no longer a geographical location. It was a vertical labyrinth where front lines were measured in centimeters and life expectancy was measured in hours. German tanks, the iron fist of the Reich, sat paralyzed in craters, their crews picked off by unseen shooters the moment they opened a hatch. The arrogance of General Paulus manifested in a refusal to adapt. He continued to funnel waves of infantry into meat grinder assaults against fortified ruins directly into the crosshairs of hidden Soviet nests. The Soviets responded with the tactic of hugging the enemy, staying so close to the German lines that the Luftwaffe couldn't bomb without hitting their own men. The German officers, frustrated and increasingly desperate, couldn't comprehend how their superior machine was being dismantled by a foe they considered industrially and racially inferior. This frustration birthed fatal errors. Every time a German commander declared a district cleared, Soviet snipers would emerge from the sewer systems to assassinate officers in broad daylight. The German sense of invincibility was being ground into the dust, one bullet at a time. As the German officer corps was being systematically decapitated by Soviet snipers, Berlin sent for its ultimate solution, Major Heinz Thorwald, often referred to in legends as Erwin Koenig. He was the head of the sniper school at Zossen, the literal architect of German marksmanship. His arrival in Stalingrad was the ultimate expression of Nazi ego. He didn't come merely to fight, he came to exterminate the vermin. He was the personification of Prussian militarism, cold, calculating, and possessed by an absolute belief in his own infallibility. His mission was singular and symbolic: hunt down and kill Vasily Zaitsev. Koenig believed that by killing the face of the Soviet resistance, he would break the spirit of the entire Red Army. He failed to understand that Zaitsev was no longer just a man. He was the personification of a city that had decided to die on its feet rather than live on its knees. As Koenig adjusted his expensive optics from the safety of a high-perch hideout, he couldn't see that he was entering a psychological trap. His arrogance told him he was the predator, but in the ruins of Stalingrad, the only true predator is the one who accepts that he is already dead. Stalingrad became a landscape designed for paranoia. The Soviet snipers utilized the city's infrastructure in ways the German manuals never predicted. They moved through the subterranean gloom of the sewers, emerging behind German lines like ghosts. German soldiers began to fear the very air they breathed. Every shadow on a wall was a potential executioner. The German high command, in its rigid arrogance, refused to allow tactical retreats to better defensive positions, insisting on holding every strategic pile of bricks. This created isolated pockets of German troops that were slowly and methodically picked apart. Supply lines were non-existent, and death came with a silent, high-velocity crack. The German soldiers realized that their Balkenkreuz emblems were nothing more than target markers. Snipers didn't care about medals, but they prioritized the men who wore them. Every time a German lieutenant stood up to lead a charge, a hidden marksman would end his life before the command could leave his lips. The hubris of a leadership sitting in heated bunkers miles away was sending thousands of young Germans into a slaughter they couldn't even see. The confrontation between Koenig and Zaitsev became the war's most famous micro-conflict. It was a clash of two worlds, the German aristocrat with the finest equipment versus the shepherd from the Urals with the mass-produced Mosin-Nagant. Koenig used every professional trick in the book: decoy helmets, changing positions under the cover of artillery, and studying the sun's reflection. He was certain that Zaitsev could not match his intellectual rigor. For days they lay motionless in the freezing rubble, two men turned into statues of ice and iron. Koenig's arrogance was his undoing. He fell for the oldest trick. Zaitsev raised a glove on a stick, and Koenig, convinced he had finally outsmarted the Russian amateur, exposed himself for a fraction of a second to confirm the kill. In that heartbeat, Zaitsev's bullet found its mark. The master from Berlin fell into the Stalingrad dust, not because he lacked skill, but because he possessed too much ego. His death was a tectonic shift in the city's morale. If the best the Reich had to offer could be killed by a peasant, then the myth of the master race was a lie. Nothing illustrated German impotence and arrogance quite like Pavlov's house. A simple four-story apartment building, defended by a mere handful of Soviet soldiers, became an impregnable fortress that defied an entire German division for months. The German officers, unable to admit that they were being stopped by a few infantrymen, marked the building as a Festung, or fortress, on their maps. They launched tanks, dive bombers, and heavy artillery at the structure, but every time the dust settled, Soviet snipers from the roof and basement would open fire again. The German pride demanded they capture it at all costs, yet they lost more men trying to take that one building than they had lost during the entire fall of Paris. This obsession with a single point of resistance while their entire army was being bled dry was the hallmark of strategic blindness. It was a war of ego, where the Germans refused to bypass an obstacle because their pride couldn't stomach the humiliation of being held back by a sergeant and a few snipers. As the urban battle raged, the German rear area logistics collapsed into a void. Hitler and Goering had promised that the Luftwaffe would supply the Sixth Army from the air, a claim of monumental arrogance. It was physically impossible to fly in the thousands of tons of fuel, food, and ammunition needed for 300,000 men. German soldiers began to wither away, eating their horses, and eventually the leather of their own boots. The snipers' jobs became even easier. They were now targeting men who were too weak to run, too cold to aim, and too hollow to care. The German officers continued to insist on polished uniforms and rigid salutes, a desperate attempt to maintain a facade of order in a city that had become a mass grave. Every shell they fired was an irreplaceable treasure, while the Soviets, dismissed by Germany as industrially incompetent, sent thousands of fresh T-34 tanks and millions of rounds of ammunition across the Volga every night. The gap between German fantasy and Soviet reality had become a canyon that would swallow the Wehrmacht whole. In November 1942, the ultimate price for German arrogance was paid. The Soviets launched Operation Uranus, striking at the flanks held by ill-equipped Romanian and Italian units. German generals had ignored intelligence reports of a massive Soviet buildup, believing the Russians had no more reserves. They were convinced the Red Army was on the brink of collapse. When Soviet tanks broke through the lines in just hours, closing the pincers around Stalingrad, the German command was paralyzed by shock. They couldn't believe they had been so brutally outmaneuvered by the uneducated. Suddenly, the hunters in the city were the prisoners in a cage. The snipers were no longer just a shadow threat, they were the harbingers of the end. An entire army, the most powerful in the Wehrmacht, was cut off from the world because its leaders were too arrogant to see the obvious. The rat trap had finally snapped shut, and the elite of the Reich were the rats inside. The Stalingrad winter arrived with temperatures plummeting to 40 degrees below zero. German soldiers froze in their summer uniforms because the generals had predicted the war would be over in August. The arrogance of Berlin had now transitioned into a form of ritualized suicide. Hitler forbade any breakout, ordering his men to die where they stood. Snipers on both sides became the only true masters of the ruins. But while Soviet snipers received hot rations and vodka, German marksmen shivered, their fingers freezing to the steel of their rifles. Many elite German snipers who entered the city with a sense of divine right were now surrendering just for a crust of bread. The moral collapse was total. They realized they had been abandoned to die for the ego of a madman in Berlin. Inside the rat trap, there was no honor left, only hunger, cold, and the inimitable bullet from an enemy they had spent years mocking. The Pitomnik airfield was the final umbilical cord to the outside world. The scenes there were a disgrace to the German military tradition. Officers used their rank and their Lugers to force their way onto the last planes, leaving their wounded subordinates to die in the snow. This was the death of the myth of Germanic comradeship. The arrogance of the elite had curdled into a raw, ugly instinct for self-preservation. Snipers now targeted pilots and ground crews, making every takeoff a suicidal gamble. When the Soviets finally overran the airfield, the last hope for the Sixth Army died. General Paulus, who had refused to surrender for months while waiting for a miracle, now sat in the basement of the Univermag department store, surrounded by filth and despair. The man who had planned the invasion of the entire Soviet Union could no longer control his own basement. His downfall was the final symbol of an ideology that thought it could conquer the world through contempt. In January 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. It was a cynical, arrogant gesture. No German field marshal had ever surrendered alive. Hitler was effectively ordering him to commit suicide. But Paulus, faced with the total destruction of his men, did the unthinkable. He chose to live. When Soviet soldiers entered his headquarters, they found a man who looked like a ghost. German arrogance ended in the silence of a basement. Of the 300,000 men who entered the trap, only 90,000 survived to go into captivity. Of those, only 5,000 would ever return home. The snipers who had sowed death for months now stood in endless columns of prisoners. Their precision and their Zeiss optics were now merely trophies in the hands of Soviet soldiers. Stalingrad was not just a defeat, it was the moment the world realized the invincible Wehrmacht was composed of mortals who had made the fatal mistake of underestimating the human spirit.
Today, the ruins of Stalingrad have been replaced by a modern city, but the spirit of the rat trap still haunts the banks of the Volga. It remains history's most potent lesson on the price of military hubris. The German generals entered the city thinking they were writing history, only to become its darkest footnote. They underestimated the enemy, they underestimated the climate, but most of all, they underestimated their own mortality. The snipers in the ruins proved that no elite is safe if they lose touch with the reality on the ground. The master snipers from Zosin vanished into anonymous graves, while Zaitsev and his comrades became legends. The rat trap closed on the German dream of world domination, leaving behind only rusted steel and the memory of 10 minutes of wrong decisions that changed the course of human history. Power without humility is a roadmap to destruction, and Stalingrad is the eternal monument to that fall.